My name is Jacob Cromwell, and I had the privilege of reading Claire Sue Acamondo's newest piece, Evaporation. In it, I found many interesting notes and mentions to what we've learned this semester, especially in regards to the concept that we've um, repeatedly read about and acknowledged of racial melancholia. And today we're going to be briefly going over a couple of examples of poems that I found interesting through this text and tying them in with the ideas that we saw in Eng and Han's work about racial melancholia and that whole concept. This project wasn't just a literary journey, it was a bit of an emotional and analytical one as well. We'll be looking at the themes of racial melancholia in this work, as I said, but we'll also be going over how this is played into the overall AAPI community identity and how the thoughts and ideas represented in Akamondo's work reflect the overall concept and identity of the AAPI community at this moment. A lot of this has to deal with core themes that I've listed there of immigration, generational trauma, and the overall experience of being in the AAPI community and what that all sort of carries and holds. Racial melancholia, it was a term developed by David Eng and Shinhee Han, and it generally describes the feeling of mourning that results from systemic racial marginalization. So whether this be from being made fun of for being an immigrant, having the pressure put on you from your parents, for Asians, for example, there was the entire trauma that came with being labeled as like the role minority or the leading minority sort of thing. Um, all of this has contributed to feelings of racial melancholia, whether it be for older generations or newer ones with the recent trends of unfortunate Asian hate that we've seen. All of that plays in. For Asian Americans, a lot of this, not only does it tie into those previously mentioned topics, it ties into the ideas of lost homelands, a disconnect from their original culture. And this grief is often silent, unheard of, almost never discussed, but due in part, in large part, to this study from Eng and Han. Um, it's been coming to light and has been more and more discussed as of recent, which is good because it means that the healing process is finally taking hold and we can begin to work through and break down these barriers that are in place. Before we dive into the work itself, I feel it's important to get to know the author. Claire Sue Okamondo is a Taiwanese American poet who uses her words primarily to illustrate immigrant life and feelings about being an immigrant and how the transition and everything has gone. She does this primarily through the form of poetry, and her poems often center around our ideals about racial melancholia and generational trauma, whether intentional or not. I'm pretty sure for the most of the time it is, but other times it just shines through in her work regardless. Today we're going to be focusing on three poems in her latest piece, Evaporation. These three pieces, respectively, are Restless Winds, Toothpaste, and America. There are several more pieces that also tie into this whole section. I highly recommend you check it out as well. So, starting with Restless Winds, the wind is a major metaphor used throughout the entire poem. Something that can't be seen, but it still has its effect on and moves everything. The wind does not care about borders, order, or position of anything. It moves it and crosses as it sees fit. And in many ways, it's used as a metaphor for the concept of migration, as immigration also as a concept is something that uproots people, does not care about borders, and ends up changing the identity of whoever it affects most of the time. So we see a bit of the melancholia tie in the fact that this is something that just suddenly upends you and almost everything has changed. Your identity has to shift because you're in a new place and you want to fit in. Uh, Similar topics to that. In Toothpaste, we hear the story of a young girl and a big misunderstanding she has. Um, she gets gifted toothpaste and mistakes it for like a sweet treat, like candy or something of the sort. It kind of captures the innocence of a child as they make an attempt to navigate through a culture that's unfamiliar to them. Um, we also touch on the concept of shame and how immigrant children go through cultural like misunderstandings and mistakes, which often can be sources of shame and ridicule, which then becomes internalized and represents another small piece of our idea of racial melancholia. A child begins to internally mourn her own misunderstanding and mistakes and really just wishes more than anything to belong in this new place or to go back where she's from to where she knows she's like accepted and belongs. This is also a common theme that we see throughout a lot of the work. Um, Culture shock is a massive thing that I believe is like persistent and prominent in the concept of racial melancholia, as we see many, many stories of just misunderstandings and things that end up getting people ridiculed and making them feel like they don't fit in, and all of that is just internalized and builds and builds. And that's a decent amount of what Ang and Han discussed in their piece. In America, the concept of a family arriving in the new country is symbolized by the concept of snow, which snow in this poem is shown as both simultaneously a beautiful and an imprisoning thing, because as visually appealing as it is, it's all shiny, sparkly, pretty, etc. It locks people inside. The duality that snow has here is similar to the immigrant experience, as in moving to America, there's this promise of a new land, a new life that's also appealing and potentially beautiful, but it comes at the cost of isolation, disorientation, and losing your previous culture and home. So it's a steep cost to pay for something that appears beautiful and can be really nice, but it comes with its heavy downsides as well. The image is further reinforced and displayed by the character being held captive on the first day of school by a snowstorm. So just further reinforces that notice of, oh yeah, this is pretty and it's appealing, but now I'm stuck and there's nothing I can do. I feel like I don't belong. So all three of these poems, as we've discussed, share quite a few common notes. Uh, Almost all three of them connect with the concepts of displacement, longing, and regret. The displacement, as we saw in The Wind and Toothpaste, where it's, you're not in your home, you don't know what's going on. You long for a place that you're accepted and that is familiar to you. And then there's a quiet form of resilience in all of these poems as well, because no matter how much the character ends up going through, they continue to push, they continue to silently bear their burden, and in a way that is likely unhealthy, but they do continue to move, and I think that's a good message to take. But these themes all showed the immigrant journey. It isn't just a physical relocation, it's a deeply psychological journey and a challenge that all of these people must face. And I think that Akamondo does a brilliant job of showing this. She uses very vivid sensory language just by using common things that, most people don't think twice about, whether it be the wind, toothpaste, or snow. and use them all as metaphors to show us exactly how hard it is to be an immigrant and go through what they do. Now, whenever we're connecting this all back to Aang and Han, their theory helps us understand that these poems, it's not just a personal, isolated event for Agamemnon. They are a common theme and unfortunate reality for almost all Asian Americans. Because as we read about, generationally, some of this stuff sticks, whether it be through the pressure parents put on their kids that the kids then internalize, whether it be through traumatizing stories of concentration camps like we read about at one point. All of the characters in these poems are experiencing powerful forms of racial melancholia as they're mourning something without a solid title or name. While, yes, we can say that they're mourning their homeland, it's something much deeper than that, as we saw in Aang and Han's work, to where it's a lot less of a, oh, I miss my home, and more so, I long for a sense of belonging and I miss what I lost, but you can't exactly place it because there's so many factors playing into it. Um, but like I said, this mourning is often quiet and internalized as the Asian Americans search for a sense of belonging. And sometimes this leads to concepts of assimilation, which I think carries its own negative thing because then you're losing your own culture and you're not really yourself anymore. You almost try to become an ideal form of yourself just to appeal to the surroundings around you. But they continue to search for belonging, and that I think perfectly reflects Aang and Han's ideals that they presented in their work. I think that storytelling, especially in the form of poetry and prose, it's a brilliant way to express and work through the deep sadness and trauma that immigrants carry with them. Uh, Especially recently, it's allowed AAPI voices to take back their stories and what's theirs in their history and culture. And I think that it's led to a great, almost like reconnecting with history for a lot of Asian American people, because these movements and voices and everything have been gaining more traction recently as they describe their struggles and where they came from. And it's also helped destigmatize the process and healing that racial melancholia carries as well. It's been helping a lot of others begin their healing process as well. Even today, unfortunately, as I lightly touched on before, we see AAPI communities navigate their pain and trauma in silence. The pandemic on itself brought in a whole new wave of Asian hate, just as it had kind of begun to dissipate from the fallouts of World War II and everything like that. Hate crimes went on the rise again, and the question of where exactly are you from? Things like that all show the concept of racial melancholia. It isn't historical. It's unfortunately something that continues in large part today. And it's a further issue whenever you think about the fact that that whole aspect of generational trauma is now opened to the next generation again, unless we continue to amplify voices and let people know that the suffering is okay and there's ways to express yourself and let it out. You don't have to keep it all in. You can find ways to begin to deal with and help yourself through this trauma in a similar way that Mondo does through her poetry. Um, yeah, it's an ongoing issue, and I think that raising awareness about these struggles in any way, shape, or form, but especially that of writing in prose, is something that's important. I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on the matter. I want to know what connections you see between Akamondo's work and other AAPI stories that we've either read in this class or that you've seen on your own. I'd also like to know how you believe this framework helps you understand your own relationship and understanding of migrant and AAPI culture and suffering and how that all connects the idea that we've learned about of racial melancholia. Um, just to wrap it all up, I believe that Claire Sue Acamondo's poetry just wonderfully and beautifully illustrates the emotional landscape of the AAPI immigrant experience. When we look at her poems through the ideal and the lens of racial melancholy and kind of carry that with us as we read, I think that we can more effectively and deeply understand the message that's being sent by her. We better understand the costs of assimilation, the loss of identity, and the memory that immigrants carry with them, and the pain that they carry with them always. She reminds us that healing is a process that begins with being seen and being heard, and is not one that's effectively carried out in silence. The I used these two primary texts to form my analysis. I know that we've all checked out Ang and Han's piece, but if you didn't choose it for your research, I highly recommend reading Evaporation from Akamondo as well. And I appreciate you for listening, and I hope you have a good one. Thank you.